Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the Voice of Reason. In this video, we are continuing our ongoing coverage of the Russian-Ukrainian war, and I'd like to go back in time to the start of the actual Russian buildup, the talk and discussion about the prospect of the Russian move into Ukraine. And generally speaking, there were three options that most believed that the Kremlin may launch. Those three options were a limited operation designed to seize control of the rest of Donetsk and Luhansk, a more limited military operation. The second was a larger military operation designed to control Luhansk, Donetsk, and create a land corridor from the eastern Donbass to the Crimea. The third scenario was a Russian invasion to seize control of all territory east of the Dnieper River. I felt that was Russia's ultimate goal, was to seize control of all territory east of the Dnieper River, and then reevaluate if the Russian military could cross the Dnieper River and invade the rest of Ukraine, seizing control of Kiev and other major cities. And then finally, the fourth scenario was, and most of you have heard the Red Arrow scenario. That was an operation designed to decapitate the Ukrainian government, seize control of Kiev, while at the same time conducting a multi-front operation to seize control of large parts of Ukraine. And ultimately, that's what the Russian military attempted to do. I understand that some of you believe that the effort by the Russian military, this green area here, provided by Deep State, is the initial Russian failed operation to seize control of Kiev. Again, some of you think this was a diversion. Again, I do not believe, again, without a shadow of a doubt, this was not a diversionary attack. You don't do this. A diversion would look different. It was not a diversion. And then in the end, unfortunately for the Russians, it resulted in a military defeat because of the level of resistance. There was some failed operations that occurred, especially near Hostomel, and then other operations that were especially near Chernihiv, and the Russian entry near Sumy, and the movement from Sumy, Chernihiv towards Kiev was just fraught with Russian casualties and local military defeats that took place because of the tenacity of the Ukrainian resistance. In other areas, the Russians performed a lot better, especially coming out of Crimea. What's surprising was the lack of a Russian success near Luhansk and Donetsk. I think most analysts believe that the Russians would very quickly seize control of all of Luhansk and Donetsk, which obviously has not occurred as of yet. But if you go back to my very early videos, and I talked about the prospect of this war, and I talked about these two very large industrial nations going at each other, and depending on the support that the Ukrainians were going to receive from the West, and especially if this became the Red Arrow scenario, because the Russians hadn't properly mobilized yet, that this was going to be an incredibly messy war. And most analysts, again, talked about a very quick Russian victory. If you remember the mainstream media, the talking heads at the Pentagon we're all saying the Russians are just going to roll into Kiev. They're going to roll over the Ukrainians and seize control of Ukraine. And go back to my earlier videos, I was like, well, put the pause button here. That's not what's going to happen. This is going to be a bloody, messy affair. And I based a lot of what I said on my belief was what happened during Maidan. Those protesters are now fighting this war. And those protesters, backed by Western nation states, which removed the earlier government, the pro-Russian government of Ukraine, it was more or less a successful January 6th move by Western-backed protesters that seized control of Ukraine. It was not a democratic process, okay? So it would have been much like Trump supporters seizing control of the U.S. government and ousting Biden. However, that wasn't successful, but what the Ukrainian protesters did was successful. It was not democratic. There was no election, and they drove the Kremlin-backed president of Ukraine out through force, through threat of violence. And that's what happened. So it's how ironic now the West is supporting the very institution that came to power essentially via not non-democratic processes. The world's crazy. But ultimately, the ability of the Ukrainian army, the ability of the Ukrainians to resist the Russians were vastly underestimated. And much of that has to do with, one, Western intelligence, Western help to the Ukrainian military, and again, large segments of the Ukrainian military that was willing to fight and continues to fight presently. Now, finally, we are seeing the Russian military start to actually mobilize. If you go back and you look at the organizational chart of the Russian military prior to the invasion of Ukraine, and you look at the Russian organizational chart now, which we don't even really know what that looks like. The Russian military is expanding rapidly. So rapidly, and there's so many multiple facets to this expansion, it's very difficult to ascertain the true makeup and composition of the Russian military at this point. I am trying to do that. It's very difficult to do that. And I'll try to explain why that is happening. So in this build-up by the Russian military, you have conscription, massive amounts of conscription going on, in excess of 300,000, probably pushing 500,000. You have normal conscription. You have volunteer pushes going on, and all the throughout the Russian Federation republics and oblasts that are creating a variety of different units, volunteer units. You have the Russian National Guard, the Federal Guard Service, expanding and creating its own independent units that are continuing to pop up and expand and enlarge and get bigger. Russian regiments and brigades are now becoming divisions. So we are seeing the general mobilization of the Russian state. They haven't come out and stated, hey, we're under war mobilization, but their economy, their wartime economy, is transitioning to a wartime economy. The military-industrial complex is rapidly expanding. We're seeing the Russian military adapt to what's happening on the ground right now. And then again, just in terms of sheer numbers, we're seeing that rapid expansion of the Russian military. And I think, especially in the West, what the West is miscalculating right now is what that's going to look like 3 years from now. Could this war continue for another 3 years? Yeah, quite possibly. I mean, obviously, look how long World War II lasted. So the Russians right now, it does appear that they're military goals are first to destroy the Ukrainian military in the eastern Donbass. And it's probably going to be, a dual operation driving from the south north, designed to roll up the right flank of the Ukrainian military. Possibly another operation coming out of Belgorod, south of Belgorod, in the direction of Kharkov. As I talked about early in this war and leading up to the war, I felt that if the Russians were looking to launch an expanded operation, which, again, I wasn't sure if this was even going to happen, and I felt that if it was going to occur, that it would probably be a series of cruise missile strikes by the Russians to degrade and destroy the Ukrainian rear areas. I felt that the Russians would try and interdict and or destroy the ability of the Ukrainian military to cross the Dnieper River, while at the same time seizing control of Luhansk and Donetsk, with the possibility that they would expand to seize the land corridor to Crimea and Kharkov. I believe Kharkov is very important ultimately to Russian decision makers in the Kremlin. I believe, and I still believe, that the Russians plan on at some point seizing control of Kharkov. Now, they're going to have to besiege Kharkov. They're going to have to envelop it, circumvent it, and cut it off, and essentially starve the city out until it capitulates. It's going to be very difficult for the Russian military to physically move into Kharkov. It is a very large city, second largest city in Ukraine, very well defended, vast underground metro complex in the city, under the city, lots of underground bunkers. It's, we really haven't seen a war yet on the face of the earth, quite literally, where we were fighting in what you could define as near megacities. It hasn't happened. So we anticipate, or they've talked about the possibility of, say, for instance, a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. Taipei is a megacity. That would be something new. The size of Kharkov right now, again, is much bigger in terms of the cities that we observed in World War II, outside of maybe the fighting that occurred outside of Moscow. But the fighting in World War II never got to the point where the Germans and the Russians were fighting inside of Moscow. Even Leningrad, St. Petersburg, probably not as big as modern-day Kharkov, especially with the underground metro system and just the sheer size and scope of the city. So it's going to be tough for the Russians to seize control of Kharkov physically. They'll have to envelop it, circumvent it, and then have it capitulate. And that's going to be messy. But again, in all probability, the war effort right now for the Russians is to expand from the south of, or north of Melitopol, north of Mariupol, and drive north. And then if the Ukrainians are looking east, this is going to be their right flank. And it just makes sense that the Russians would try and roll that right flank up and then have the ability to attack Kramatorsk from the south, attack Kramatorsk from the east, and quite possibly attack Kramatorsk and Sloviansk from the north as well. Stage 2 of said operation would then be the looking at late summer, would be the Russian attempt to seize control of Kharkov. If they don't do that sooner rather than later, I don't think it's going to happen sooner. I think it's going to happen later, stage 2, late summer. And then again, the reinvasion with the attempt to seize control of all lands east of the Dnieper River. I think ultimately that's how the Kremlin would see military victory. They have to get control of the landmass east of the Dnieper River, give the Russians that natural defensive barrier, which is the Dnieper River, which runs from the Black Sea all the way up to Belarus near Chernobyl. Is there a likelihood that the Russians would try to retake Kiev? It's possible, but unlikely. Possible, but unlikely, as is a operation to seize control of Odessa or even the rest of western Ukraine. Very difficult for the Russians to do that. There is a great number of hurdles for the Russians to overcome prior to even considering operations towards Odessa and even Ukraine. I think it's off the table at this point. The Russians would have to first cause the generalized collapse of the Ukrainian military in the eastern Donbass, east of the Dnieper River, destroy the ability of the Ukrainian military to supply its forces in the eastern Donbass, east of the Dnieper River, and the Russians haven't done that yet. Now, is that to say the Russians can't do that and won't do that eventually? I can't say that. Again, based on what we know in terms of the mobilization, the expansion of the Russian military, they are going to build up that capability, and it's going to look a lot different in the next 6 months, the next year, the next 2 years, than the Russian military we've seen 6 months ago. The Russian ground forces were probably about 300,000 at the start of this conflict. You're going to see a Russian military that's north, not military, but ground forces that could be north of 800 to over 1 million that will eventually become a standing army. It'll become a military more like what we saw during the Soviet period than what we have seen 6 months ago. Hope that makes sense. But that's what we have for today. We're going to continue to analyze, continue to report. We are anticipating a Russian operation to start within the next week or two. Again, I believe they're going to try to roll up the right flank of the Ukrainian forces with the goal of seizing control of Bakhmut, Sloviansk, Kramatorsk. Now, if this operation fails, does that mean it's over for the Russians? Absolutely not. As I've said before, I look for more progress in the expansion of the Russian military to take place in late summer. That's all I have for today. Thank you for joining us. Have a good day.